Okay, so that I believe that catches us up on the latest, especially with the Austin Eckler news. So if we don't get to something, that's because it happened after we were recording. We're sorry. We'll get to it next time. But Greg, I want to wrap this up with you. We're going to play a quick game. We asked you ahead of time. We got a handful of categories from the first day of free agency, and I just want to trade notes with you about how this first day went. So let's just start it off. And it can be anything. It could be a big name. It doesn't matter. It could be whoever you want. But so far from what we've seen, what's your favorite signing? What's your favorite move in free agency this year?
I think I like Saquon Barkley to the Eagles, honestly. It's a
Okay.
lot of money by modern running back money. But to think that what he did in New York with a less than ideal offense and offensive line, I think he could be really productive in that offense. I think he could be one of the few backs to justify a $12 million a year salary. And I like it. I thought they did well there. They let some guys go. They picked some guys up. They kind of had a busy day today. But I like the idea of what Barkley can be in that offense.
So here's my thing with Saquon. He goes to the Eagles on a 3-year, 37, $38 million. There's some incentives baked in there as well. He's a wonderful player. He's got 1,600 all-purpose yard potential. Does Saquon, and maybe I'm wrong, but does Saquon raise the Eagles' ceiling? I mean, they just had a 1,200-yard season from DeAndre Swift. They got Miles Sanders, a major deal in free agency the year before that. It just doesn't feel like production from that position was their problem, in my opinion. Like when you consider the money that they could have spent on the back end of their defense or the fact that Jason Kelsey is retiring, I just wonder if they could have spent that money. Xavier McKinney going to the Green Bay Packers on a huge deal stands out to me of like, I think maybe that raises the Eagles' ceiling a little bit higher than Saquon. But I don't want to sound like a
Yeah.
hater either, because I do think this is going to be incredibly fun to watch.
Right, and fixing the defense probably was a bigger priority for the Eagles than upgrading their offense. I mean, the second half of the season, the reason they were who they were was their defense was awful. So, I think they're hoping that a new coordinator there helps. A couple of new pieces shuffled in and out. They're not done there in Philadelphia. Um, no more Fletcher Cox, which is strange. But to bring in somebody already, I think they're going to be active, especially on the back end. So we're not done with it. But like I said, I just liked it as a rare use of resources at running back in this league, higher than whatever the kind of $8 million threshold everybody
Sure.
else seems to be at right now. Josh Jacobs got a lot of money from Green Bay today. That's also a power move, if you
Those
will.
those are both going to be incredibly fun to watch, both of those running backs. My favorite is this is boring, but I think it's going to pay dividends. The LA Rams quietly signed Jonah Jackson for 3 years, $50 million. And remember, last week they re-signed their own guy, Kevin Dodson. So really fortifying the interior of that line, which I think is always a great move when you have a veteran quarterback like Matthew Stafford. Kyron Williams breaking out in a big way at running back for them. So these aren't moves that are going to sell a lot of jerseys, but man, I feel good about a Rams offense that was already very good last year.
Sure.
All right, let's keep it pushing. This one has potential to be boring. I know my answer is boring, but that's fine. The most impactful signing for you so far.
I think I have to go with Cousins. I think it's
Yeah.
just it's the most franchise changing move. It's
I
a
don't
huge
I don't
dollar.
think you have a choice but to say Kirk
Yeah,
Cousins.
and if I wanted to be like non-quarterback division, I think I might say Christian Wilkins going to the Raiders, just because it's so rare to let a talented D tackle like that loose on the open market, and I think having him inside is going to make Max Crosby like a 24 sack guy. Legit major big season ahead for Max Crosby because they have a lot more they have to deal with on the interior of that Vegas front. So I like that too. If I had to get out of the quarterback box, that's where I'd go next. Is Christian Wilkins getting paid by the Raiders in Las Vegas?
I think that's another thing worth mentioning. And I'm right there with you, obviously. Max Crosby almost won Defensive Player of the Year anyway. This is only going to help. Tyree Wilson, the top 10 draft pick from last year, another guy that could benefit in a big way from just having a space eating, matchup eating monster like Christian Wilkins in the middle there. But yeah, I
Right.
mean, Kirk, you do have to just, you got to throw it out there that Kirk Cousins, I said this earlier today, whether you think he's great or not, the Falcons are in the conversation now. They are a relevant
Right.
team, a team that should expect to make the playoffs. And that just hasn't been the case since about, I don't know, 2018 or so.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing Arthur Blank, the owner, is well aware of that, and that's why he was willing to spend this money. Is like, hey, I remember how it feels to make the playoffs every year, and I'm sick of not doing it.
Yeah. 6 years without it. That's a drought. And it's one of those where, again, they've set themselves up where I think now if they're not a playoff team, it's a disappointment in Atlanta, which
Yeah.
says something. It's been that long since you've been.
Absolutely. Again, talking about fun offenses. I mean, you think of all the top 10 picks they've spent at the skill positions here over the last 3 years. I'm sure fantasy football players are going to be very invested in what's going on with the Falcons. All right. What about an under the radar signing? Like, it can't be Saquon. It can't be Josh Jacobs, but somebody that's under the radar that really piqued your interest here.
I'm going to go Andrew Van Ginkel. I'm going to go
Yep.
Minnesota Vikings. Brian Flores getting one of his old Miami guys and bringing him up.
That
It's not a
qualifies.
big, it's 2 years, 20 million. It's fairly inexpensive. But I think it's a good pick for them. They brought in a couple different defensive guys. I mean, obviously they lose Cousins today. That's going to be the headline of Minnesota is who the heck is their quarterback moving forward. But their defense got better. And if they can find an answer at quarterback somewhere between Cousins and Sam Darnold, I think their defense will be better for it.
I'm a big fan. This one happened relatively recently before we recorded, but the Cincinnati Bengals brought in Geno Stone on a 2-year, $15 million deal. Safety play was so big for defensive coordinator Lou Anarumo there in Cincinnati. When you think about Jesse Bates earned a huge payday with Atlanta last year, Von Bell in Carolina. Lou Anarumo turns out knows how to use a versatile safety, and Geno Stone had an amazing year, not even as the primary guy. He got a lot of playing time due to injuries, but 9 pass breakups and of course 7 interceptions for Baltimore last year. If a defensive mind like Lou Anarumo wants you, I'm going to assume it's probably a pretty good move, and I'm guessing Geno Stone, and that is not a big contract. Like Geno Stone has the potential to very much outplay that deal.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And when you look at, I mean, that defense, if you're going to borrow from a defense, if you're going to steal from a defense, that's the defense you want to do it from.
Right.
And like you said, I think they took a step back to lose Bell, to lose Jesse Bates. I think it was inevitable they'd take a step back, and their losses, their drop off defensively kind of got obscured because they'd lost Burrow and they weren't nearly the team overall. But if you think about defensive minds, like I said, Lou's near the top of the list, and this gives him a big weapon and a center fielder who, again, is probably good for 5 or 6 picks in that defense.
Okay. It's all been very positive, very friendly to this point. We're not going to say, like, I think it's so dumb to call somebody like a loser on day one of free agency. Like I said, 75% of these deals are probably not going to age very well. Like, you can go back and look and see, of all of this money that gets spent, a lot of it is going to be regrettable. But with that said, I think it's interesting to look at the process, like look at why teams do things and who they target. And we can't say that they are a loser, but some of these moves are confusing. So I'm curious if you have a head scratching or a confusing decision that went down here today.
Yeah, I'll give you 2. The first one was literally the first contract signed today, and that's DeAndre Swift going to the Bears, getting 3 and 18. I felt like there was a little bit of a warning last year, and the Eagles had a Pro Bowl running back in Miles Sanders, had like 1,300 yards, 11 touchdowns in Philly. He goes to Carolina, gets paid well, like $6 million a year, and did nothing in Carolina. Granted, a terrible offensive situation, but he went from like 4.9 a carry to like 3.3 a carry. And you wonder, like, oh, how much of that was just getting to run behind an amazing offensive line in a loaded offense in Philly? And now, again, DeAndre Swift comes to Philly, does well, gets 1,000 yards, makes the Pro Bowl, boom, gets paid. And I just wonder, I worried that Chicago, who didn't want to pay David Montgomery money a year ago and let him walk, and he goes and has 13 touchdowns and 1,000 yards in Detroit, why they're now looking to pay somebody who did really well in another offense, but I don't know if he's going to have that same success in Chicago. Now that I'm done dumping on him, I will also give a shout out to John Runyon. There was kind of this crazy guard jackpot money being distributed today. Robert Hunt got paid. A lot of guys got paid in ways. Landon Dickerson got 21 million a year. Guard is like right there with tackle now in the crazy offensive money going out. But Runyon got 3 and 30, and I just don't know if I thought of him as a above average guard. I think he was number 47 among guards. Pro Football Focus this year. Not that PFF is the end all, but that's bottom quarter of starting guards. So to go out and think that he's the answer and give him 10 million a year, it felt like a non-answer or a half measure to me there.
I'm baffled by almost everything that the Jacksonville Jaguars have done today. And the crazy, like, look, I get it. You're going to lose players. If you don't hit on your draft picks, you've got to replace them in free agency. The market is always going to be more expensive. So I get it. You got to spend money to replenish a team. That's what we were talking about with Washington. But my thing is, we just watched Jacksonville have a similar day to this 2 years ago. And for the most part, those deals haven't really worked out that well. You know, Christian Kirk has had his moments, but I don't think has lived up to the deal that he signed a couple years ago. Florenzo Fatukasi, the defensive tackle, they released him last week. And then they go out today and they signed Gabe Davis to a 3-year, $39 million deal. Darnell Savage, who I think most Packers fans would tell you they're hoping to find an upgrade to Darnell Savage. He gets a nice deal. Mitch Morse, who was recently released, granted, I mean, that's a cost-saving measure by the Buffalo Bills, but it's just weird to see the Jags go back to the same strategy that got them to a disappointing finish this year. Like, you know, they're in the mix for the 1 seed and they fall apart down the stretch and they're back here doing things the exact same way. I think the whole thing is very confusing is the perfect word for it. Like, you were all here 2 years ago. Why are we doing this again?
So sometimes there's that lag where you get the news that a team has signed somebody, but you don't get the money right away, right? And you kind of get excited, like, oh wow, that's a big name, but you don't know the context of like, how much was that dress? Or like, that was a nice dinner. Well, how much did that dinner cost? And so I literally built it up in my head as being a far worse contract for Gabe Davis than I was worried they're giving Gabe like 3 and 50.
Sure.
Big like 6, like again, I probably was more critical of Christian Kirk's deal when he got it, and he's probably been closer to earning that value than I expected him to. But Gabe Davis, when it came in at 13 mil a year, I was like, oh, you know what? That's actually not bad. That's almost wise spending on the first day of free agency, and you don't see that. So within that weird expectation I built up in my head, I was like, you go Jaguars.
Okay, but you're not wrong, but here's the confusing thing. And granted, it's 1 day. We'll see what they do. But look, I don't mean to crap on Gabe Davis. I think he fits a very specific and useful role. He had some big moments in Buffalo, but I think Gabe Davis needs a number 1 receiver. And we know that's not Christian Kirk, despite what the money says. And we don't know what's going to happen with Calvin Ridley, who is currently still sitting out there. I mean, if the Jags bring back Calvin Ridley, I would look at it and say, wow, you are spending a hell of a lot of money on your top 3 receivers, first of all. But so if they do that, then fine. I would say you have a very expensive receiver core, but it looks pretty good. But what if they don't? I mean, I don't think you move Gabe Davis and Christian Kirk up a layer in terms of their involvement in the offense. Like I said, it just seems like a backward way to do things, in my opinion.
Yeah, I was presuming that they were moving on from Ridley. I didn't expect them to add a $20 million and a $13 million receiver in the same year. So if they did, I mean, Gabe is not a get people excited about losing Calvin Ridley replacement type move. And Jacksonville's got to be careful. And then Jacksonville had that window where it looked like the division was theirs, and now Houston is right there. Tennessee has a new coach. Indy's going to have, with luck, a healthy Anthony Richardson leading them after what was a surprisingly resilient team last year. And if they're not careful, the Jags can really fall behind in a bad division.
Yeah, and which is a crazy thing to say about a team that I saw as a potential number 1 seed in the playoffs last year, was fighting for it with 6 weeks to play. It's crazy how quickly life can change.